She didn't scream when the riders circled her in the dark. She was done screaming. 3 days on a stagecoach from Missouri. Everything she owned in a single trunk. And now this horses breathing steam into the night air, men with rifles grinning down at her like she was something they'd already decided to take. Hannah Brooks pressed her back against the pine tree and thought, "So this is Montana." Then a shot cracked the dark wide open. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. The rider fell from his saddle before the echo of the shot had even died in the trees. The second man yanked his horse sideways, eyes scanning the dark. The third one, the one who'd been reaching for Hannah's arm, let his hand drop like he'd touched fire. Nobody moved. Then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of footsteps that weren't in a hurry because they didn't need to be. A man stepped out of the tree line with a rifle resting easy across one arm, the barrel still trailing a thread of smoke. He was tall, not in the showy way of men who wanted you to notice, but in the way of something built by weather and hard years. His hat was low. His jaw was set. His eyes moved from one rider to the other like he was counting a debt. "Ride," he said. One word. No raised voice. No threat attached to it. He didn't need one. The two remaining riders exchanged a look. Then they gathered their horses and went pulling the riderless animal behind them, leaving only the sound of hooves fading into the pines and the slow return of the crickets. Hannah realized she'd been holding her breath. She let it out. Let it. The man didn't look at her right away. He looked at the tree line, at the trail the riders had taken. He waited 5 seconds, 10, like he expected them to come back. When they didn't, he finally turned. His eyes were dark, careful. The kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. "You hurt?" he asked. Hannah pulled herself upright from the tree. Her dress was torn at the sleeve. Her hands were shaking, though she pressed them flat against her skirts so he wouldn't see it. "No," she said. "I'm fine." He looked at the torn sleeve, said nothing. "I said I'm fine." "Yes, ma'am." He turned back toward the trees. "Stagecoach is half a mile back. Left wheel's broken clean off. Driver ran." "I know, I was there." "Hmm?" He moved past her back toward the road. "Town's 4 miles east. You can walk or you can ride. Up to you." Hannah looked at him, at his back, at the rifle still loose in his hand. "I don't know you," she said. He stopped walking, didn't turn around. "No, ma'am," he said. "You don't." A long pause. The wind moved through the pines overhead. "Ethan Walker," he said at last, still not turning. "I work cattle in these mountains. I'm not going to hurt you, but I'm also not going to stand here all night convincing you of it." He started walking again. "Like I said, up to you." Hannah stood in the dark for 3 full seconds, thought about the riders, thought about 4 miles of Montana wilderness with no weapon and no lantern, thought about the look in that third man's eyes before the shot. She followed. His horse was a big gray animal, broad-backed and calm, tied to a pine at the edge of the road. Ethan untied it without ceremony and looked at Hannah with a question he didn't bother to voice out loud. "I can ride," she said. "Never said you couldn't." He helped her up with one hand at her elbow, quick, impersonal, already letting go, before she was fully settled, then took the reins and walked. On foot, leading the horse. Hannah watched the back of his neck. "You can ride too," she said. "There's room." "I know." He kept walking. She stopped trying to make conversation. The moon was high and the road was pale beneath it. They moved through the dark in silence, just the soft blow of the horse's breath and the crunch of Ethan's boots on the dry summer earth. The heat was still thick even at this hour, the way Montana summers could be close and dry and smelling of pine resin and something faintly wild underneath. Hannah watched the tree line, watched the shadows. "Those men," she finally said. "Who were they?" "Trouble." "I gathered that. Do you know them?" A pause. "Seen them around?" Working for someone? He glanced back at her over his shoulder. Just once. You ask a lot of questions for a woman who just wrote in. I'm a teacher, Hannah said. It's a professional habit. Something shifted in his jaw. It might have been the beginning of a smile. She couldn't tell in the dark. Teacher, he said. From where? Missouri. I have a contract with the school in Harlan Creek. I start Monday. Harlan Creek. He said it flat, no particular feeling in it. You know it. Know of it. He said nothing more. Hannah decided she'd let that go, for now. The town of Harlan Creek sat in a wide valley below the Bitterroot Range, and at midnight it looked like a painting of itself. The Main Street lantern lit the saloon, still spilling piano music into the warm air. The white church at the far end standing quiet against the stars. It was smaller than Hannah had imagined. Quieter. But prettier too in the way that wild things could be pretty. Ethan walked her to the front steps of the only hotel and stopped. Harlan Creek Hotel, he said. Mrs. Purdy runs it. She'll have a room. Hannah slid down from the horse. Her legs were steadier now. She smoothed her skirts, pushed her hair back from her face, and turned to look at him properly for the first time in full light. He was younger than she'd thought in the dark. Or maybe not younger, maybe just different. The hard lines of his face belonged to a man who'd been outside in all weathers for a long time, but his eyes, now that she could see them, weren't old eyes. They were watchful eyes, eyes that held something back. Thank you, she said. Mr. Walker. He touched the brim of his hat. Ma'am. Turned the horse's head. Will I see you again? She didn't know why she asked. It came out before she'd thought it through. He paused with his back to her. Probably, he said, and rode away into the dark. Hannah met Victor Harlan the next morning at breakfast. He was already seated at the best table in the hotel dining room. When she came down, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with silver at his temples, and the kind of face that had once been handsome and had grown into something more than that authoritative warm. The face of a man comfortable with being looked at. He rose the moment she entered, smiled like they were old friends. Miss Brooks. He extended his hand across the table. Victor Harlan. I own the cattle operation east of town. I sit on the school board. His grip was firm and brief. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Hannah sat across from him. A woman brought coffee without being asked. You know who I am, she said. Small-town Miss Brooks. Word travels. I heard about the trouble on the road last night. I'm deeply sorry. I want you to know that kind of thing isn't typical of our valley. He shook his head. Drifters. The territory's been seeing more of them lately. The man who helped me, Ethan Walker, he said he works cattle. He works for me. Victor poured her coffee himself, unhurried and gracious. One of my best men. I'm glad he was there. Hannah looked at her coffee. She thought about Ethan's face in the lantern light. Thought about the one-word answers. The careful eyes. He seems very... She searched for the right word. Self-contained. Victor laughed a rich, genuine sound. That's generous. Most people just say he's unfriendly. He leaned back in his chair. Walker's had a hard run of it. His brother Thomas took sick 2 winters ago. Lungs. Ethan's been carrying the medical bills ever since. A man carrying that much weight doesn't leave much room for pleasant conversation. Hannah filed that away. I appreciate you introducing yourself, Mr. Harlan, she said. I'm looking forward to meeting the families, starting the school. And we're looking forward to having you. He smiled again. The warm, practiced smile of a man who'd been charming rooms his entire life. Harlan Creek needs someone like you, Miss Brooks. Someone with conviction. He rose, buttoned his jacket. If you need anything at all, my door is open. He left. The dining room seemed louder after he was gone. Hannah sat with her coffee and thought about the word conviction and how different it had sounded in Victor Harlan's mouth than it did in her own head. She spent that morning unpacking her trunk in the small room upstairs, hanging her dresses, stacking her books, pinning her teaching certificates to the wall above the writing table. It was a good room, clean windows. A view of the mountains to the west, those blue-shouldered peaks cutting the sky in a way that made the Missouri prairie seem like something from a dream she used to have. She liked it here. She hadn't expected to, but she did. She was out the door by noon. The school building was at the east end of town, a single-room structure with a fresh coat of white paint and 8 wooden desks inside. Someone had swept it recently. Someone had left a small bunch of dried wildflowers on the teacher's desk. Hannah stood in the empty room for a moment and felt something settle in her chest. This was why she'd come. This exact thing. She was measuring the blackboard when the door opened. She turned. A woman stood in the doorway, early 40s, sun-worn, with 2 boys at her sides and the unmistakable posture of someone who'd worked hard for a long time without much recognition of it. She looked at Hannah the way you looked at something you wanted to trust, but weren't sure you could afford to. "Mrs. Calloway," the woman said by way of introducing herself. "My boys are Jesse and Cal. They'll be in your class. Miss Brooks." Hannah held out her hand. The woman shook it with a grip that was brief but real. "I'm glad to meet you." The boys stared at her openly. Jesse, the older one, had a bruise along his left jaw, old enough to be yellowing at the edges but still there. Hannah didn't remark on it. She crouched down to their level and said, "Which one of you is the better reader?" Jesse pointed at Cal. Cal looked mortified. Hannah laughed, and that seemed to break something open because Mrs. Calloway's posture eased slightly, and she said, "We heard good things about you, from back in Missouri." I hope they were true. Mrs. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Something passed behind her eyes. "Miss Brooks," she said quietly, "you should know there are people in this town that'll be glad you're here, and people that won't." She said it like she was warning her about weather, like it was just a fact of the landscape. "Just so you know going in." Hannah looked at her steadily. "I appreciate the honesty, Mrs. Calloway." The woman nodded once, took her boys and went. Hannah stood in the empty schoolroom and thought about what she'd said. About the boys who needed teaching. About Jesse's bruised jaw. About Victor Harlan's smooth, practiced smile. She found Ethan Walker by accident on her 3rd day. She'd gone south along the creek bed looking for the Hendersons, a farming family whose children had missed enrollment at the school, and the trail she'd been following dead-ended at a fence line she hadn't expected. She followed the fence east, thinking she'd find a gate, and instead found a man crouched over a length of cut wire with a pair of pliers and an expression like a thundercloud. He didn't hear her approach over the wind. "Mr. Walker." He looked up fast, the instinctive reaction of a man who spent time in country where surprises weren't welcome. Then his face settled when he saw her. "Miss Brooks." He set the pliers down, stood. "You're off the trail." "I was looking for the Henderson place." "Henderson's 2 miles north." His eyes moved to the wire, to the fence. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "I've noticed people keep saying that to me." She looked at the wire. "Was it cut deliberately?" He looked at her, a long measuring look. "3rd time this month," he said finally. "Somebody cuts the fence cattle drift south onto the open range. Somebody drives them off." He said it plainly without emotion, which somehow made it worse. "Henderson lost 40 head that way last spring. Abernethy lost 60. 2 families that were doing fine this time last year are barely holding on now." Hannah felt something cold move through her despite the heat. "Who's driving the cattle off?" He picked up the pliers. "That's the question. Do you have an answer?" He said nothing, just crouched back down and began working the wire. Hannah crouched beside him. He looked sideways at her. "You don't have to." "I have 2 hands, Mr. Walker." She held them out steady and open. "Show me what to do." He looked at her hands, at her face. Something shifted behind his eyes that she couldn't quite name. "Hold this end," he said. "Don't let it spring back." She held it. They worked in silence in the summer heat, the creek murmuring below them, the mountains watching from the west. It was strange, Hannah thought, how easy silence could be with some people and how heavy it was with others. With Ethan Walker, it wasn't heavy at all. It was just the 2 of them doing a necessary thing, and neither of them needing to fill it with words. "Your brother," she said at last. Thomas. His hands didn't stop moving. Mr. Harlan tell you about him? Yes. Then you know. I know he's sick. I don't know much else. A pause. He twisted the wire ends together with practiced efficiency. 12 years younger than me, Ethan said. Took our mother's lungs the same as she did. She made it to 52. He paused. Thomas is 26. The number sat between them. I'm sorry, Hannah said, and she meant it without any of the polish people usually put on the phrase. He glanced at her. He's still alive. That's what matters. He stood, dusted his hands on his thighs. Henderson Place is north along the creek. Stay on the east bank, you'll see the chimney before you see the house. He gathered his tools. He was leaving. Mr. Walker. She stood. The wire, the missing cattle, the families losing their land. She watched his face. You know something. He stopped. Didn't turn around. The wind moved through the grass. A red-tailed hawk crossed the sky above the mountains in one long banking arc. Be careful, Miss Brooks, he said quietly. This valley has a way of eating people alive that ask too many questions. He walked away. She watched him go, the tall, unhurried figure moving south along the fence line, and felt the warning settle into her bones like weather. She went north toward the Henderson place. She was going to ask the questions anyway. The town hall meeting happened on the following Thursday evening. Hannah hadn't planned to speak. She'd planned to listen. She'd sat in the back row with her hands in her lap and her mouth closed for the better part of an hour, while Victor Harlan stood at the front of the room and talked about grazing rights and land value and the territory's promising future, and the assembled ranchers and shopkeepers had nodded along the way. People nodded at men who held their notes. But then Mitchell Abernethy had stood up with his hat in his hands and said quietly that he couldn't make his payment this month. Couldn't make it next month either, most likely. And Victor had said with enormous warmth that he understood that he always tried to work with his neighbors, that he had patience, that he only asked that Mitchell hold up his end of the agreement they'd signed in March. The agreement Mitchell had mentioned to Hannah 3 days ago. The one he'd signed when the creek flooded his winter pasture and he'd had no choice. Hannah stood up. She hadn't planned to. Her legs just did it. Victor looked at her with mild, pleasant surprise. Miss Brooks, he said. Did you have a question? A few. Her voice was steady, which was strange because her heart was beating very fast. Mr. Abernethy, what were the original terms of your agreement with Mr. Harlan? Mitchell looked startled to be addressed directly. Looked at Victor. Looked back at Hannah. 30-day notice before any debt collection action, he said slowly. And a right of first offer if he ever decided to. The agreement you signed in March didn't include those terms, Mitchell. Victor's voice was still warm, still patient. I'm afraid you may be misremembering. I'm not. I have the signed document. We can review it together. He smiled at the room. A reasonable man dealing reasonably with a confusion. Miss Brooks, I appreciate your interest in our community affairs, but these are contractual matters between private parties. 13 private parties, Hannah said. In the past 8 months, all of whom signed agreements with you during emergencies. All of whom are now behind on payments. And 2 of whom, the Henderson family and the Callaways, have had cattle go missing from fenced pastures 3 times each. The room had gone very quiet. Victor looked at her. The warmth in his face was still there, perfectly intact, but something behind his eyes had changed. Something had gone still and cold and absolutely focused. Those are serious accusations, Miss Brooks, he said softly. They're observations, Hannah said. I haven't accused anyone of anything yet. She sat down. The meeting ended shortly after. People filed out in clusters of 2 and 3, not meeting her eyes. Mitchell Abernethy gripped her hand on the way out and said low and quick, "Thank you," and then looked frightened by his own gratitude and walked away fast. Hannah stood outside the hall in the warm summer night, waiting for her heart to slow down. That was brave. She turned. Ethan Walker was leaning against the wall at the corner of the building, arms folded, hat low. She hadn't seen him at the meeting. She hadn't known he was there. "You were inside," she said, "the whole time. You didn't say anything." "No." She looked at him. "You know I'm right." His jaw tightened. "I know you just painted a target on yourself in front of the most powerful man in this valley." "I know that too." He pushed off the wall, came closer, close enough that she could see the worry in his face, not for himself, she realized, for her. "Go back to Missouri, Miss Brooks," he said quietly. "Take the next stage east and don't look back. There are other schools, other towns. There are other children here," she said. "Jesse Calloway has been coming to school with bruises for 3 weeks. 2 families are about to lose their land. And nobody in that room has said one word about any of it except Mitchell Abernethy, and he looked terrified the moment he did." She held Ethan's gaze. "I'm not going back to Missouri." He looked at her for a long moment. The night air was warm around them, thick with the smell of pine and dry summer earth. "Then God help you," he said, softly, not unkindly. He put on his hat and walked away into the dark. Hannah watched him go. She thought about what Victor Harlan had looked like in that moment when the warmth went still behind his eyes. She thought about fences cut in the night and cattle driven off, and families that had been fine one year and failing the next. She thought about Ethan Walker saying "God help you" with his back to her, and something in his voice that sounded less like a farewell and more like a promise. She walked back to the hotel alone. Tomorrow she would start asking the questions that no one wanted answered. She had a feeling Ethan Walker would be there whether she asked him to or not, and Victor Harlan had just been told quietly, publicly, in front of his own assembled valley, that someone in Harlan Creek was no longer afraid of him. The smiling man with the silver temples stood at the edge of the same dark street, watching the schoolteacher's straight-backed figure disappear into the hotel. He stopped smiling. He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a folded piece of paper, and handed it without a word to the man standing at his shoulder. "Find out everything about her," Victor said. "Missouri, her family, anyone she owes money to, anyone she cares about." He buttoned his jacket. "And send word to the county sheriff. I want him here by Friday." He walked back toward the light. And Hannah Brooks, settling into the small hotel room with its mountain view and its teaching certificates pinned neatly to the wall, had no idea that the most dangerous man in the Bitterroot Valley had just decided she was a problem that needed to be solved. The sheriff arrived on Friday, just like Victor said he would. Hannah was in the middle of a reading lesson when she heard the horses. She didn't stop teaching. She kept her voice steady and her eyes on the children and finished the paragraph about the boy and the river. And only when she'd dismissed them for their noon break did she walk to the door and look out at the main street. 2 men, both on horseback, both wearing stars. The taller one had the kind of face that had made up its mind about everything a long time ago and wasn't interested in new information. He rode straight to Victor Harlan's office above the land company and didn't look at the schoolhouse at all. Hannah watched him go. Behind her, Jesse Calloway hadn't gone outside with the other children. He was still at his desk, turning his reader over in his hands, not reading it. "Jesse?" He looked up. "Do you know that man, the sheriff?" Jesse's eyes went to the window, went back to his reader. "That's Sheriff Cade," he said. "He came last spring, too, after Mr. Hendricks said something at the grazing meeting." A pause. "Mr. Hendricks left town 2 weeks later." Hannah kept her voice easy. "Left town or was made to leave?" Jesse didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She sent him outside, stood in the empty schoolroom and thought about Mr. Hendricks and Sheriff Cade and Victor Harlan's smooth, unhurried walk up those office stairs. Thought about how the machinery of a corrupt town worked, not with open violence, not at first, but with pressure. Quiet, patient, mounting pressure, until the inconvenient person decided on their own that somewhere else was a better idea. She was still thinking about it when Mrs. Purdy knocked on her hotel room door that evening and told her with genuine regret in her voice that she needed the room back. Hannah stood in the doorway. "I've paid through the end of the month." "I know." Mrs. Purdy couldn't quite meet her eyes. "I'll refund the difference. I'm sorry, Miss Brooks. I've got a family obligation, a cousin coming, She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry," she said again. Hannah looked at her, at the apologetic slope of her shoulders, at her hands twisting together at her waist. "Someone spoke to you," Hannah said quietly. Mrs. Purdy said nothing, which was everything. "All right." Hannah kept her voice level. "I'll be out by morning." She packed her trunk, sat on the edge of the bare mattress, pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. This was how it started. She knew that now. She slept that night on a cot in the back of the Calloway barn, which Ruth Calloway offered without hesitation and with a fierceness in her voice that made Hannah feel unexpectedly like crying. "You'll stay here as long as you need," Ruth said. She was a compact, straight-backed woman who moved like she was always slightly ahead of whatever came next. "Don't argue with me." "I wasn't going to." Ruth looked at her sharply, then satisfied went inside. The barn smelled of hay and horses, and the particular warmth of large animals sleeping. Hannah lay on the cot and stared at the dark overhead and thought about Mrs. Purdy's hands twisting together, about Jesse's face when he'd said Mr. Hendricks left town 2 weeks later, about the way the room had gone quiet at the town hall meeting when she'd stood up. She wasn't afraid. She identified the feeling, carefully testing it, and found something closer to anger. The slow, clarifying kind of anger that settled into the chest like ballast and made you steadier instead of shakier. In the morning, she taught school. The first child didn't show up on Monday. The second was gone by Wednesday. By the following week, Hannah had 7 students, where she'd had 19. Their empty desks were not moved. She kept teaching to the 7 who remained the Calloway boys, the Miller girl. 4 others whose families either hadn't gotten the message or had chosen to ignore it. She taught them everything she knew. She worked harder than she'd ever worked. She did not remark on the empty desks. But after school on Thursday, she rode to the Abernethy place and found Margaret Abernethy in the yard with a look on her face like someone bracing for a blow. "Miss Brooks," Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm sorry about Danny. He won't be coming back to school." "May I ask why?" Margaret looked past her, down the road, back. "Mitchell got a letter from the land office," she said low and fast, like she was getting it out before she could stop herself. "They're saying the original deed has a filing error. They want him to come to the county seat and sort it out, but the county seat is 3 days' ride, and if he leaves now with harvest coming—" She stopped. "It'll work out fine, I'm sure," she said louder now. The warmth gone out of it. Someone was watching. Hannah didn't turn to look. "I'm sure it will," she said gently. "Tell Danny I miss him." She rode back to town. She was 300 yards from the schoolhouse when a man stepped into the road in front of her, not one of Victor's riders. She didn't recognize him at all, broad through the chest wearing a coat that was too heavy for the summer heat hands hanging loose at his sides. "You're the school teacher," he said. "Yes. Mr. Harlan thinks you'd be happier in a different town." He said it the way you said the weather was looking fair. Conversational. Easy. "Thought I'd pass that along?" Hannah looked at him, at the coat, at where his hands were. "Thank you," she said. "I'll take it under consideration." She rode past him at a walk, kept her spine straight, didn't look back. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the school, but she got down from the horse and went inside and graded papers until they stopped. She found the first family the next morning, or rather she found the place where a family had been. The Morrison place was 4 miles east, a small farm, 2 parents, 3 children, the youngest of whom, a girl named Clara, had been Hannah's best reader. Hannah had ridden out thinking she'd check on them, bring a book for Clara, maybe convince the parents to send her back. What she found was an empty house with the door hanging open. She went inside. The furniture was still there. The dishes were on the shelf. A pot was on the cold stove like someone had set it down and walked out mid-preparation. She stood in the middle of that silent kitchen for a long time. Then she got back on her horse and rode. The Delacroix place was empty too. Smaller farm farther east, closer to the mountains. The garden was untended but still green, which meant they hadn't been gone long. A child's shoe was on the porch steps. Hannah dismounted, picked up the shoe, held it. They left 3 days ago. She spun around. Ethan Walker was sitting on the fence rail at the corner of the yard, one arm across his knee, watching her. He was wearing the look he often wore, the one that showed nothing but meant a great deal. "Where did they go?" Hannah asked. "Don't know. Fast wherever it was." He looked at the house. "Morrison family too, I reckon, from that look on your face." "Why didn't you tell me? You were teaching school." "Ethan." She crossed the yard toward him. She was angry and she let him see it. 2 families gone, no warning, no goodbye, just gone. She stopped in front of him. "What is happening in this valley?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he climbed down from the fence. "Walk with me," he said. She walked. He talked. Not the way he usually talked, in short, careful fragments, each one measured before it left his mouth. He talked like a man who'd been holding something back for a long time and had just made a decision about it. "Victor Harlan has been in this valley for 14 years, Ethan said. "When he came, he was the 4th biggest cattle operation in the territory. Now he's the biggest, by a lot." He kept his eyes ahead on the mountains. "The families that used to sit above him on that list are all gone. Most of them sold. Some of them left fast, like the Morrisons. One of them, a man named Garrett, who had the biggest spread in the Eastern Valley, died in what the county recorded as a riding accident." His jaw was set. 3 witnesses said his horse was fine, said there was nothing wrong on that trail. Hannah walked beside him and listened. "The land company holds notes on most of the small farms in this valley now." Ethan continued. "Victor's been buying debt quiet for years, waiting. When he decides it's time for a family to move on, he finds the number on their note, sends someone to the land office to flag a filing irregularity, cuts their fence, drives off their cattle, sends a man to stand in the road." He paused. "And if none of that works, he finds other ways. And you've known this." Hannah said carefully. "How long?" He was quiet for a moment. "Long enough," he said. "And you've worked for him?" "Yes." "Why?" He stopped walking, turned to face her. The honesty in his expression was uncomfortable to look at, not because it was false, but because it wasn't. "Thomas's medical bills are held by Victor's land company," he said, "same as the farm notes. If I walk away or cause trouble, he calls in the debt and Thomas loses his care." He held her gaze. "I know what that makes me." "It makes you a man with no good options," Hannah said. He looked at her like he hadn't expected that. "I've been trying to find evidence," he said. "Something I could take to the territorial marshal, something that can't be explained away." He paused. "Garrett's accident, the missing families, the altered deeds. I need something concrete, one piece of solid proof. I want to help." "No." "Ethan, no." Firm. Final. He started walking again. "You're already a target. You stood up at that meeting and said what nobody else would say, and now Harlan has people watching you." He glanced sideways at her. "The man in the heavy coat. Don't look surprised. I know about him. That was a warning." "I know it was a warning. Then you know that the next thing won't be a warning." Hannah thought about Clara Morrison's shoe on the porch steps, about Jesse Calloway's bruises, about Mitchell Abernethy gripping her hand outside the town hall and then looking frightened of himself. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm still not leaving." Ethan made a low sound that wasn't quite a word. "Stubborn woman," he said. "Observant man," she said. There was a pause. Something almost like warmth moved across his face, just for a second. "I'll look into the deed records," Hannah said. "I have a reason to visit the land office. School registration requires copies of property documentation for the children. I can ask to see the original filing logs." "They won't show you anything useful." "They might show me what's been altered." She looked at him. "I was a school teacher in a county seat for 4 years, Ethan. I know what official documents look like, and I know what they look like when someone's put a hand in them. He considered that. "Don't go alone," he said finally. "I won't ask you to go with me. I know what it costs you." "I didn't say you had to ask." He looked ahead. "Tuesday morning, early. I'll be at the creek crossing." He walked back toward the fence without waiting for her answer. Hannah stood in the empty Delacroix yard and watched him go, and felt something settle between the anger and the grief, something steady and certain and surprisingly warm. She thought not for the first time that Ethan Walker was a great deal more complicated than a man who said very little. The land office was run by a man named Prescott, who had the eyes of someone who'd made a series of small dishonorable choices over a long period of time and had learned to live with them by not thinking too hard about anything. He greeted Hannah with cautious pleasantness and Ethan with a look that lasted about half a second too long. Hannah explained about the school registration. Prescott relaxed slightly. He was comfortable with teachers wanting documentation. Normal request. No threat. He brought the registration files. Hannah went through them carefully, methodically, while Ethan stood near the door and said nothing, and Prescott watched them both from behind his desk with the particular stillness of a man who wanted to seem unconcerned. The registration files were clean. Hannah hadn't expected anything else. Victor wouldn't compromise that layer. But the registration files were cross-referenced to property deeds, and the deed index had to sit on the same shelf right there behind Prescott's left shoulder in plain sight. And while Hannah was asking Prescott a detailed question about the cross-referencing system, watching him turn to answer it, Ethan crossed quietly to the shelf, ran his finger down the index spines and stopped. He looked at one entry for approximately 3 seconds. Then he stepped back to the door. Hannah wrapped up her question and thanked Prescott, and they left. Outside, walking toward the creek, Ethan kept his voice low. "Morrison deed," he said. "Filed in March of last year. It's listed in the index as having a recorded lien from June of this year." He paused. Morrison family was already gone by the time that lien was filed. Hannah processed that. "They backdated it," she said, "or filed a lien on a property they'd already forced the family off of. Either way, it's not legal." Another pause. "And there were 3 other deed numbers next to Morrison's with the same notation. Same month, same hand." "Whose hand?" Ethan looked straight ahead. Prescott's. The weight of it hit Hannah all at once. Not Victor Harlan's name on anything. Prescott. A county official. Which meant this went further than one powerful rancher pressuring his neighbors. This was a system. This was constructed. "That's why the marshal hasn't come," she said quietly. "Victor isn't just buying land. He has people inside the county structure." "Yes." "So who do you report a corrupt county official to?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Territorial government, Helena." He looked at her. "Which means someone has to get there without Victor's people knowing. And someone has to have proof, not just an index entry a judge could call a clerical error. We need the original deed filings. We need something Victor can't walk back." He stopped walking. "Hannah." It was the first time he'd used her name. He didn't seem to notice. "This isn't a thing we fix by asking the right questions anymore. This is bigger than this valley." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "You should be frightened." "I am," she said honestly. "But frightened doesn't mean stopped." He looked at her for a long moment in the summer heat. The mountains behind him. The creek, bright and indifferent below. Something in his face moved, not quite the warmth she'd seen before, but something deeper, something that had more weight to it. "I have to tell you something," he said. She waited. "Victor approached me 2 weeks ago," Ethan said. "Before your town hall meeting. He told me you'd be arriving and that you might be trouble." He said the word with a particular tone. "He asked me to report to him on what you said and who you spoke to." Hannah went very still. "And did you?" she asked. Her voice was even. "I told him you were a schoolteacher who minded her own business." His eyes didn't move from her face. "That's the last thing I've told him about you." She breathed. "I'm telling you now," he said, "because you have a right to know what you're dealing with. And because—" He stopped. Because he looked away, toward the mountains, back. Because I'm done, he said simply. With all of it. The debt, the silence, the fence mending for a man who cuts the fences. I'm done. He squared his jaw. I don't know yet what that costs, Thomas, but I'm done. Hannah felt something crack open in her chest. Not the sentimental kind of crack, but the honest kind. The kind that happened when something true was said out loud. We'll figure out Thomas, she said. He looked at her sharply. There are doctors in Helena who don't work for Victor Harlan, she said. If we get to the territorial government, we get to resources Victor can't touch. She held his gaze. We figure it out. Ethan stared at her. You barely know me, he said. I know enough, she said. I know you repair fences in the heat of the afternoon for families that aren't yours. I know you spent 3 months pretending to work for a criminal to protect your brother. I know you carry things quietly, and I know you're one of the only people in this valley who's decided to do something about what's happening here. She looked at him steadily. That's enough for me. He was quiet for a long time. The creek moved below them. All right, he said at last. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without decoration, with the full weight of what it meant behind it. All right, Hannah agreed. They walked back toward town side by side, and that night 3 things happened. A barn belonging to the Calloway family caught fire at midnight and burned to the ground before anyone could reach it. Ruth Calloway got her boys out and stood in the yard with her arms around both of them and watched it go. A note appeared under the door of the schoolhouse. Stay silent, or the children pay next. And Mitchell Abernethy, who had shaken Hannah's hand outside the town hall and called it gratitude, was found at first light by his wife, beaten badly enough that he couldn't stand, with no witness and no explanation that anyone in authority was willing to write down. Hannah stood in the Abernethy yard in the gray morning light, looking at Mitchell's face, and felt the anger she'd been carrying shift into something harder and colder and more resolute. Victor Harlan was no longer just pressuring people. He was sending a message, and the message was meant for her. She looked up from Mitchell's face and found Ethan standing across the yard watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was grief, she realized. The old settled kind that had been living in a man for a long time and was finally finding something worth coming out for. He crossed the yard toward her. I know where Victor keeps his records, he said quietly. The real ones. Not Prescott's index. Victor's own ledger. The one that lists every deal, every threat, every dollar paid to every official in 3 counties. He stopped in front of her. He keeps it in a lockbox at the ranch house. East study, 3rd drawer. Hannah looked at him. You've seen it, she said. Once. 2 years ago, before I understood what I was seeing. His voice was flat. It lists Thomas's debt specifically, with a notation beside it. He paused. The notation says, leverage maintain. The words landed in Hannah's chest like stones. He never intended to let Thomas go, she said. No. Paying the debt wouldn't have freed you. No. She looked at him, at the grief and the steadiness and the decision she could see had already been made. Then we get the ledger, she said. He nodded once. That's going to start a war, he said. It's already a war, Hannah said. We've just been the only ones not fighting back. The morning light came up gold over the Bitterroot Peaks and lay itself across the scorched ground where the Calloway barn had been, and somewhere in the valley, a hawk called once and went silent. And Ethan Walker looked at Hannah Brooks across the yard of a battered man's home, and something passed between them that neither of them put into words. They didn't need to. There was work to do. They planned it for 3 days and argued about it for 2 of them. Ethan wanted to go alone. Hannah refused. Ethan said it was too dangerous. Hannah pointed out that she was already sleeping in a barn because Victor Harlan had pressured her landlady, that Mitchell Abernethy was recovering from a beating with no legal recourse, that 2 families had vanished from their homes like smoke, and that a note had been left under her schoolhouse door threatening children. She said all of this in a voice so steady and so utterly without hysteria that Ethan ran out of reasonable counter-arguments and settled for unreasonable ones. "You don't know the ranch layout," he said. "You'll show me." "You've never done anything like this." "Neither have you." He opened his mouth, closed it. "I've never broken into a man's house and stolen evidence of criminal conspiracy," he said finally. "Neither have I," Hannah said. "But I've graded 412 essays on the American justice system, so I understand the principle." Something moved in his jaw that he was fighting very hard not to let become a smile. "Thursday night," he said, "Victor hosts his monthly dinner. Every county official he owns, the Sheriff Prescott, 2 men from the Territorial Land Board. The ranch house will be full of people in the front rooms and empty everywhere else." He looked at her. "East wing. 3rd drawer. In and out in 10 minutes. "Agreed. If anything goes wrong, anything, you run. You don't wait for me, you don't come back. You ride straight for the Calloway place, and you don't stop." "Ethan, that's not negotiable." She looked at him, at the set of his jaw and the worry he was trying to wear as firmness. "All right," she said quietly. He nodded, looked away. "I'll get the horses." Thursday came in hot and still, the kind of summer night that sat heavy on the chest and made sounds carry farther than they should. They rode out at 10, when the dinner would be deepest, into its 2nd hour, Victor at his most expansive, and his guests at their most comfortable. Ethan knew the pattern. He'd attended enough of those dinners as the reliable help in the yard, present enough to be invisible. They didn't speak on the ride out. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said. Hannah rode beside him and kept her breathing even and thought about Mitchell Abernethy's face, about Clara Morrison's shoe on the porch steps, about Jesse Calloway, who had come to school that morning and done his reading with a concentration so fierce it looked like defiance, which Hannah had decided was exactly what it was. The ranch house was lit up against the dark like something festive and wrong. Music drifted from the main windows. Laughter. The sound of men who believed they were safe. Ethan tied the horses a 1/4 mile out in the trees. They went the rest of the way on foot. The east wing was dark. The window Ethan had described was unlatched. He'd seen to that 2 days earlier during his last required appearance at the ranch. Hannah had not asked how he'd managed it without raising suspicion. She'd decided there were things Ethan Walker handled best without an audience, and this had been one of them. He went through the window first, helped her through after. His hands were quick and certain, and let go the moment she had her footing. The study was dark. Ethan moved without hesitation. He'd described the room to her in such detail, she could almost see it herself. Desk, bookshelf left, cabinet right, 3rd drawer. She heard the soft protest of wood as he pulled it open. A pause. A longer pause. "Ethan." Her whisper was barely a sound. "It's not here." 3 words. They landed in the silence like stones dropped in deep water. Hannah crossed to him. The drawer was open. She could see it even in the dark papers, a folded letter, the outline of a small cash box. But no ledger. No leather-bound record of 14 years of organized theft and murder. "He moved it," Ethan said. His voice was flat, controlled. The control of a man who understood that the next 30 seconds required absolute steadiness. Could it be somewhere else in the room? He wouldn't keep it in the open. It was always the lockbox. "Ethan," someone told him. The thought arrived fully formed and cold. He moved it because someone told him we were coming. He went still. Then from the hallway outside the study door, footsteps. Not the casual movement of a dinner guest looking for the washroom. Deliberate, measured, stopping directly outside the door. Ethan had Hannah by the wrist and moving toward the window before the door handle turned. She went through first, dropped into the dark below, landed, and moved clear. He came through half a second behind her. They were flat against the exterior wall when the study light came on and a figure moved across the window above them. Neither of them breathed. The figure stood at the open window for a long moment, looking out, looking at the dark. Then it moved away. They went through the trees at a fast walk that was almost a run. Ethan's hand at Hannah's elbow, not guiding so much as keeping the pace, and they didn't stop until they reached the horses and the cover of the pines. Hannah pressed her back against a tree and breathed. "Who knew?" she asked. "3 people." Ethan was already thinking she could see at that particular stillness that meant his mind was moving fast. "You, me, and—" He stopped. "Ruth Calloway," Hannah said. She'd told Ruth the broad shape of the plan, not the details, but enough. Ethan shook his head. "Ruth Calloway has more reason to bring Victor Harlan down than anyone in this valley. It wasn't Ruth." "Then who?" He looked at her. "I need to think," he said. "Right now we need to move. They know someone was in that study. They'll search the property." They rode. He took her north into the mountains, which was not the plan they'd made, and not any plan at all, just the only direction that put distance between them and the ranch before Victor's men could saddle up. The summer night pressed close, and the trail climbed, and Hannah rode without asking questions, because Ethan's back was straight, and his pace was deliberate, and she had learned enough about him to know that was not the posture of a man without a destination. They rode for 2 hours. The ranch Ethan brought her to was small, barely more than a cabin, with a good roof and a solid corral. An old man came to the door with a lantern and a rifle, and a face that could have been carved from the same wood as the cabin walls. "Ethan," the old man said. No surprise in it, like he'd half expected this. "Frank." Ethan dismounted. "We need the back room. 2, maybe 3 days." Frank looked at Hannah. His eyes were sharp and not unkind. "You're the teacher," he said. "Yes, sir." He lowered the rifle. "Coffee's on." His name was Frank Aldridge, and he'd been in these mountains for 30 years, which meant he'd been here before Victor Harlan and intended to be here after. And that alone told Hannah something important about him. He poured coffee and asked no questions, and when Hannah thanked him, he said, "Don't thank me. I'm 81 years old, and if I can't do what's right at 81, I wasted the previous 80. He went to bed. Hannah sat at the small table with her hands wrapped around the coffee cup and let herself be shaken for the first time since the study window, just for a moment. Just the internal acknowledgement that they had gone to steal evidence, found nothing, nearly been caught, and were now in a stranger's back room in the mountains with Victor Harlan's people about to discover they'd been in his house. She let herself be shaken. Then she put it away. "We were betrayed," she said. "That's a fact. We need to figure out by whom, and we need to find another way to the ledger." Ethan was quiet across the table. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said. She waited. "Prescott contacted me yesterday." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Said Victor wanted to offer a deal. Thomas's debt forgiven entirely in exchange for—" He stopped. "In exchange for me leaving," Hannah said. "In exchange for your cooperation in leaving." His jaw tightened. "And my agreement not to pursue any further inquiries. And you didn't tell me because you were considering it." The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "Ethan, he's my brother," he said. It came out rough. Not an excuse, just a true thing said out loud. Hannah looked at him across the narrow table in the old man's cabin in the mountains, with the summer dark all around them, and felt the full weight of what this man had been carrying alone for 2 years. And she didn't say anything soft or reassuring, because he wasn't a man who needed softness right now. "Did you give him an answer?" she asked. "Not yet." "Then here's mine, since he apparently included me in it." She set her cup down. "No, we don't take the deal. Not because I don't understand what Thomas means to you, I do. But because Victor Harlan will call that debt in again the moment it suits him, whether we made a deal or not. A man who uses leverage maintain as a bookkeeping notation does not release leverage. He just finds new terms." She held Ethan's gaze. "The only way Thomas is truly free is if Victor is finished." Ethan looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I know that. I've known it for a long time." He set his cup down. "I just needed to hear someone else say it." She nodded. Then let's figure out where the ledger is, she said. It was Frank Aldridge, of all people, who gave them the answer. He came in the next morning with eggs and the casual air of a man who'd been thinking overnight and had arrived at something useful. "Victor Harlan has a second property," he said, setting the eggs down. "North of the main ranch, up the east fork of the Bitterroot. Old mining claim, been off the books for 15 years. He rebuilt the cabin on it 6 years ago." Frank poured himself coffee. "I know because I watched him do it. You can see the roof from the ridge trail if you know where to look." He looked at Ethan. "If I had something I didn't want found, I wouldn't keep it where people knew to look." Ethan and Hannah exchanged a look. "How far?" Ethan asked. "Day's ride, hard country. Can we get there without going back through the valley?" Frank studied his coffee. "There's a high trail, Hunter's Route, cuts north through the pass. You'd come in from above, which is better anyway. You don't want to be riding up that canyon from the south, too exposed." "Frank," Ethan said, "this puts you at risk." The old man waved his hand. "I'm 81, son. Everything puts me at risk. Go eat your eggs." They ate their eggs. They were saddling up 2 hours later when Frank came out and pressed a folded paper into Ethan's hand. Ethan unfolded it, looked at Frank. "Survey map," Frank said. "Old one. But the terrain doesn't change." He turned back to the cabin. "Victor doesn't know I have it. He bought out most of the original mining claim holders 15 years ago. I was the one who said no." He stopped at the door. "Been waiting for someone with a reason to use that map ever since." He went inside and closed the door. Hannah looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the map. "Let's go," he said. The high trail was everything Frank had implied, and more. The summer heat that was thick and pressing in the valley thinned as they climbed, replaced by the sharp, clean air of altitude and the particular silence of country where very few people went. The horses worked hard. The trail was narrow in places, barely a trail at all, just a suggestion of direction in the rock and scrub. They stopped once to water the horses at a stream, and Hannah's leg cramped badly enough that she went down on one knee when she dismounted, and Ethan caught her arm before she'd fully registered she was falling. "I'm fine," she said by reflex. "You always say that," he said. "And I'm usually right." He kept hold of her arm until she'd straightened. His grip was steady and unhurried. When she nodded that she was solid, he let go, but not immediately. A half-second longer than necessary. Neither of them commented on it. They rode on. An hour below the pass, one of the horses threw a shoe. Ethan dismounted, checked the hoof, stood up with an expression that said the situation was manageable and also profoundly inconvenient. "How bad?" Hannah asked. "We can't push her on this terrain. She'll go lame." "Then we walk. I'll walk. You ride." "Ethan, that's efficient," he said flatly. "You're a smaller load. Horse will be fine with one rider on this grade. We just go slower." So they went slower. Ethan walked beside her horse, and the horse picked its way carefully, and Hannah watched the back of Ethan's neck and the set of his shoulders and thought about all the things he'd done in the past week alone that he hadn't mentioned or complained about. The fence repairs, the deliberate lies to Victor, the evidence gathering that had put him in direct opposition to the man who held his brother's life in his account's ledger. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "When this is over," she said, "what do you want?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "A piece of ground," he said at last. "That's mine. Small enough to manage, big enough to matter." He kept walking. "Maybe cattle, maybe horses, something living." He looked at the mountains. "Quiet." "That's a good answer," she said. He glanced at her. Something warm in it. "What about you?" he asked. "I want to keep teaching, somewhere that needs it and knows it needs it." She thought about Jesse Calloway reading with that fierce concentration. "And I want to see Mitchell Abernethy's children get what they're owed, and the Morrisons find their way back to this valley if they want it, and Clara Morrison to have her reader back and a desk to read it at." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You remember all of their names," he said. "They're my students. Some of them you only knew for 2 weeks. Doesn't matter. She looked down at him from the horse. They sat in my classroom and tried. That means I carry their names. He turned forward and walked and said nothing. But something in his posture had changed, a slight easing a degree or two off the permanent tension he wore. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. They reached the ridge above the mining cabin as the light was going gold. Ethan went first, low, moving along the ridgeline until he could see down. Then he came back to where Hannah had the horses. "Cabin's there," he said quietly. "No horses in the corral, no smoke. I don't think anyone's been here recently." "Victor moved the ledger here, not his people," Hannah said. "Hannah, that's what I'm counting on." He looked at the sky. "We go in now, while the light's still with us. I don't want to do this in the dark." Agreed. The cabin was simple. 1 room, a cold stove, a cot, shelves with supplies. The kind of place built for men moving through country, not for living in. Hannah began with the shelves, and Ethan went straight to the floor, which he moved across, systematically pressing, listening, looking for the particular give of a board that had been lifted and set back. He found it in 4 minutes. It was a shallow space barely deep enough for the box it held. Ethan lifted the board, reached in, and came up with a flat tin box, sealed with a simple latch. He set it on the cot and looked at Hannah. She opened it. The ledger was smaller than she'd imagined. 50 pages, maybe 60. Dense handwriting columns of numbers, names, dates. She turned to the first page and read, and her hands went still. Then she turned to another page, then another. "Is it what we need?" Ethan asked. "It's everything," she said quietly. "Ethan, it's everything. Garrett's death, the Morrisons, the altered deeds. Payments to Prescott going back 9 years. Payments to Sheriff Cade. 3 names from the Territorial Land Board." She looked up. "There's a notation about the Morrison family specifically. It says relocated under duress with a date and an amount paid." Her voice went flat. "He kept records of his own crimes, in his own hand, because he never thought anyone would find them." Ethan stared at the ledger. "Because no one ever pushed back hard enough to look," he said. They looked at each other across the small cabin in the fading light. "We need to move," Ethan said. "If Victor figures out where we've gone—" The horse outside screamed, not the normal alarm of a startled animal, the shrill, raw sound of something suddenly and badly frightened. Ethan was at the door before Hannah had fully registered the sound. He pulled it open a crack, looked shut, it hard and fast. "3 riders," he said. Low, fast, no wasted words. "Coming up the South Trail, armed, Harlan's men." He crossed the room, took her arm. "The north window, now." "The ledger?" "Already." He pressed it into her hands. She hadn't seen him move. They went through the north window, into the cooling mountain air, and Ethan took the ledger back and tucked it inside his coat, and they moved up the slope away from the cabin into the trees above it. Below them, the 3 riders reached the cabin. The door came open, voices harsh and urgent moving through the single room. Hannah pressed against a pine tree and heard Ethan breathing beside her, controlled and slow, and focused on matching her breathing to his, because it was the only useful thing she could do. "Gone," a voice from below. "Recent though, look at the floor." They got the box. A different voice, colder, a silence. Then the cold voice again. "Fan out. They're on foot up the slope." Ethan's mouth was at her ear. "Run," he said. "Now. Don't stop." She ran. The slope above the cabin was steep and thick, and the going was brutal, grabbing branches to pull herself up. Boots slipping on the summer dry ground, lungs burning in the thin air. Ethan was behind her. She could hear him, and behind Ethan, she could hear the crashing of men coming up through the brush and the harsh calling of one to another. She didn't look back. The ridge came up faster than she expected. She crested it and almost went over the other side before Ethan's hand caught her jacket and hauled her left along the ridge toward where they'd left the horses. One of the horses was gone, cut loose or spooked, Hannah couldn't tell which. The shoed horse was still there, tied hard and trembling. One horse. She looked at Ethan. "Get on," he said. "Together." "Hannah." "Together," she said, and swung up without waiting. He was up behind her before she'd settled his arm around her waist, gripping the ledger between them, and the horse lurched forward into the dark of the north slope. They rode hard and low, and the horse was carrying double, and the trail was poor, and none of it mattered, because the alternative was the men with the cold voices coming over that ridge, and the ledger pressed against Hannah's ribs, through Ethan's coat like a heartbeat. Behind them, a shot, then another, neither one close enough to matter. They kept riding. When the shooting stopped, when the sound of pursuit had faded into the general silence of the mountains, and the only sound was the horse's labored breathing, and the wind, Ethan eased the pace. Hannah became aware of his arm around her, his warmth, the solidity of him at her back. Neither of them said anything. The mountains held them in the dark, and the summer stars came out overhead, in that way they did, at altitude sharp and multiple, and so close they felt like a condition of the air, rather than a feature of the sky. After a long while, Ethan said, "You all right?" "Yes," Hannah said. A pause. "We have the ledger," he said. "Yes," she said. Another pause. "Thomas," Ethan said, and something broke slightly in that word, just slightly, just at the seam of it. Hannah understood. They had the ledger, which meant this was real now, which meant Victor Harlan, whose hand had written every name in that ledger, was about to discover that the evidence he'd hidden in the mountains had walked out of those mountains in the arms of a woman he'd tried to frighten away and a man he'd tried to own. "Thomas will be fine," she said. Ethan's arm tightened slightly around her waist, not in response to the terrain. The terrain was smooth here. He didn't say anything. But he didn't let go. They rode through the mountain dark toward Frank Aldridge's cabin, the ledger between them and the stars above them, and behind them, far below in the valley, a lamp was lit in Victor Harlan's ranch house, and a man who had never been stopped before finally understood that something had gone very wrong. And back in the valley, in a county jail cell that smelled of summer dust and old wood, a young man named Thomas Walker coughed into the quiet and stared at the ceiling, and did not know that his brother was coming, did not know that everything was about to change, and did not know that the woman riding through the mountains with Ethan Walker's arm around her had said his name like a promise she intended to keep. They reached Frank Aldridge's cabin before dawn. Frank was already up. He had coffee on and a lamp lit, and the particular calm of a man who had spent the night expecting bad news, and was simply relieved it hadn't arrived in a worse form. He looked at them, at the dirt on their clothes, the horse lathered, and spent the ledger pressed under Ethan's arm, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down, both of you." They sat. Frank poured coffee and set it in front of them, and then stood with his own cup and looked at the ledger on the table like it was a thing he recognized from a long time ago. "You got it," he said. "We got it," Hannah said. Frank nodded slowly. "Then it started." "It was already started," Ethan said. "No." Frank shook his head. "Before this, it was one powerful man doing what powerful men do when nobody stops them. Now it's a fight." He looked at Ethan. "There's a difference. You understand that?" Ethan looked at the ledger. "Yes." "Good." Frank set down his cup. "Then you need to understand something else. By morning, Victor Harlan knows the ledger is gone and knows who took it. By noon, he knows you haven't come back through the valley. By tonight—" He paused. "He'll do what cornered men do. He'll go for the thing that matters most." Ethan went still. Hannah watched the understanding move across his face, watched the color leave it. "Thomas," Ethan said. "Thomas," Frank said quietly. Ethan was on his feet before the word had finished landing. Hannah caught his arm. "Think," she said. "Fast and firm. Think before you move. If you ride into that valley alone right now, Victor is expecting exactly that. He'll have men between here and the jail. He'll use Thomas to draw you out into the open, and then you'll both be gone." "I can't leave him in there, Hannah." "I'm not saying leave him. I'm saying don't walk into the obvious trap." She kept her hand on his arm, felt the tension in it, coiled, barely contained. "We go together, with the ledger. We go to the Territorial Marshal office in Helena, and we send a wire first tonight from Frank's. There's no telegraph line up here, Frank said. Silence. How far to the nearest line? Hannah asked. Ridgeway Station, 12 miles east. Ethan looked at her. She looked at him. Both of them doing the same calculation, 12 miles of open country. Victor's men already looking Thomas sitting in a county jail cell controlled by Sheriff Cade, who had 9 years of payments recorded in the ledger under Hannah's hand. We split up, Ethan said. No. Hannah. No, she said again sharper. That is not how this ends. We do not split up. If you go to Ridgeway and wire Helena, I can get to Thomas before... Before what? Before Victor's men reach the jail. Ethan Cade works for Victor. He's been working for Victor for 9 years. It's in the ledger. Thomas isn't just a hostage. He's leverage that Victor can eliminate the moment he decides the ledger is a bigger problem than the leverage is worth. Her voice was flat and true, and she watched every word land on him. If we split up, we lose one of those threads. We need both. We need the wire sent and Thomas out of that cell before Victor makes his next move. Ethan stared at her. Then how? He said. Hannah looked at Frank. Frank looked back at her with the measured expression of an 81-year-old man who had lived in the same mountains long enough to have a great many old acquaintances. Frank, she said, is there anyone between here and Ridgeway you trust completely? Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My nephew runs the Ridgeway station. Would he send a wire to Helena without asking questions? He'd send a wire to the president himself if I asked him to, and not say a word about it to anyone. Hannah looked at Ethan. Frank sends a rider to Ridgeway tonight. The wire goes to the Territorial Marshal tonight. We ride for the valley at first light together, and we get Thomas out before Victor gets his answer from Helena and understands the walls are closing. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. She could see him testing it, pulling at the edges of the plan, the way he tested wire looking for where it would fail. It's tight, he said. Everything about this is tight. If Cade moves Thomas before we get there, then we find him, but we go together. She held his gaze. I need you to trust me the same way I've been trusting you. He looked at her face. Something moved through his eyes that was complicated and tired and absolutely certain, all at once. All right, he said. Frank was already putting on his coat. Frank's rider left within the hour, a young man named Dix who worked the upper pasture and asked no questions and rode like he'd been born on horseback. Frank watched him go and said, He'll be at Ridgeway before midnight, with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what his people could do. Hannah and Ethan slept in shifts, 2 hours each. Neither of them slept fully, the kind of half-rest that left you more aware of your own heartbeat than before, but it was better than nothing, which was the alternative. In the gray hour before first light, Hannah sat at the table and opened the ledger to the section on Sheriff Cade. She read it through twice. She found the entry about Thomas Walker and read that too. The notation Leverage maintain looked different in the pre-dawn gray than it had in the mountain cabin. More deliberate, more cold. She was still looking at it when Ethan came and sat across from her. He'd seen it before. He looked at it again now briefly and looked away. When this is over, he said, I want to burn that book. After the Territorial Marshal photographs every page of it, she said. After that, he agreed. She closed it, set her hands flat on the cover. Ethan, the person who betrayed us, who told Victor we were coming for the ledger. She looked up. I think I know. He waited. Prescott knew we'd been in the land office, she said. He knew what we'd seen in the index. He didn't know what we were planning, but he reported to Victor that we'd been looking at the deed records, and Victor made the connection, Ethan said slowly. He knew I'd seen the ledger once. He knew that if we understood what the deed records meant, I'd eventually tell you about the ledger. He paused. He didn't need a specific informant. He just needed to be smart enough to anticipate the next move. Which he was. Ethan agreed. which means we didn't have a betrayal. We had a man who was 3 steps ahead of us. He looked at the ledger. Until we went north instead of east. He didn't anticipate Frank, Hannah said. Nobody anticipates Frank. Something like warmth moved across his face. 81 years old, and still the most dangerous man in the Bitterroot. Hannah almost smiled. Almost. Let's go get your brother. Dugga. They came into the valley from the north as the sun broke the mountains, which meant they came in with the light behind them and the town still mostly asleep. And Victor Harlan's men, if there were any on the north road, would be looking into the glare. There were 2. Ethan saw them first 2 riders sitting their horses at the crossroads where the north trail met the main valley road. Not moving, just sitting. He pulled up. Hannah pulled up beside him. They'll have seen us, she said quietly. Yes. So we don't run. No. He straightened in his saddle. We ride past them like we belong here, which we do. He looked at her. Keep the ledger inside your coat. If they stop us, you're a school teacher coming back from visiting a friend in the hills. And you? I'm a cowboy heading to work. He looked at the 2 riders. Let me talk. They rode forward. The 2 men watched them come without moving. One was the man from the road, the one in the heavy coat who'd told Hannah Mr. Harlan thought she'd be happier in a different town. He recognized her. She could see it. Walker, the coated man said. His eyes moved to Hannah and back. Morning, Ethan said. Easy, unhurried. The voice of a man who had nothing to explain. Mr. Harlan's been looking for you. I heard. Ethan kept his horse moving at the same steady pace. Tell him I'll be by this afternoon. A pause. The coated man's eyes moved to the shape of Hannah's coat. She kept her face neutral and her hands loose on the reins. He said, now, the coated man said, I've got something to finish first. Ethan didn't stop, didn't speed up, just kept riding past them the way a man rode who was accustomed to being obeyed in matters concerning his own schedule. Afternoon. Hannah rode beside him and did not turn her head and did not breathe fully until they had covered another 200 yards and the sound of the 2 horses behind them had not come. They're watching us, Ethan said, very quietly. Don't look back. I know. She kept her eyes forward. How long before they report? They already reported. Someone will be riding to Victor right now. He calculated. 20 minutes before Victor knows we're in the valley. 30 before he can get men to the jail. Then we have 20 minutes. 18, he said. Let's go. They didn't run the horses. Running horses drew eyes in a town just waking up. They moved fast and purposeful, the way people moved when they had a reason but not a crisis. And they reached the county jail at the east end of the main street in 12 minutes. Sheriff Cade was already there. He was standing outside the jail door with his thumbs in his belt and the look of a man who had been told to expect company. He watched them ride up with the patient expression of someone holding all the cards and aware of it. Miss Brooks, he said. Walker. He looked at Ethan. You've had yourself quite a night from what I hear. Ethan dismounted. Hannah stayed on the horse. I want to see my brother, Ethan said. I'm afraid that's not possible right now. Thomas is... Cade paused, constructing the lie at a leisurely pace. Thomas is being transferred to county medical this morning. Orders from Mr. Harlan. He's arranged for a specialist. Very generous of him. The words landed like a trap closing. Hannah felt the cold move through her. This wasn't Cade improvising. This was Victor's contingency. This was what happened when the ledger disappeared from the mountain cabin. Victor had activated his next move before dawn. Thomas wasn't being helped. Thomas was being moved to somewhere Victor controlled completely. When? Ethan asked. His voice was absolutely level. Wagon's being arranged now. Then I want to see him before he goes. I don't think... He's my brother. Ethan took one step forward. Just one. And I have the right to see him before any transfer. That's territorial law, Sheriff, and you know it as well as I do. Cade looked at him, at Hannah, back at Ethan. The territorial law Ethan had cited was real. Hannah had made sure of that 2 nights ago at Frank's table, going through everything she knew about prisoner rights in the territory. Cade couldn't deny it without exposing himself as operating outside his legal authority, which, given what was in the ledger, was something he had every reason to avoid doing in front of witnesses. 5 minutes, Cade said. He didn't move from the doorway. Alone, Ethan said. Not a chance. He's a sick man, Sheriff. Let him have 5 minutes with his brother without an audience. Ethan's voice was quiet and hard. Whatever disagreement you and I have, Thomas Walker is a 26-year-old man with bad lungs who hasn't done a thing wrong in his life. Give him that much. Something shifted in Cade's face. Not conscience. Hannah didn't think conscience lived there anymore, but calculation. The calculation of a man who understood that how he treated a sick prisoner would be noted by any witnesses, and witnesses could be inconvenient in ways he was only beginning to understand. He stepped aside. Ethan went in. Hannah sat her horse and looked at Sheriff Cade. And Sheriff Cade looked back at her, and the silence between them was the most honest conversation they'd ever had. "You should have left when you had the chance," Cade said. "I know you believe that," Hannah said. "It would have been better for everyone. Not for the Morrisons," she said. "Not for the Abernethys. Not for Mitchell, who can't stand up straight yet." She kept her voice even. "Not for the man you've been taking money from for 9 years, who is about to find out that what he thought was safely buried in a mountain cabin has been sitting on a table in federal territory." Cade's eyes changed. Not guilt, fear. The specific, ugly fear of a man who understood exactly what she meant. "You're bluffing," he said. Hannah looked at him steadily and said nothing. Ethan came out of the jail in under 4 minutes. Behind him, walking slowly wrapped in a blanket despite the summer morning, came a young man who was clearly Ethan's brother, the same dark eyes, the same set to the jaw, though his face was thinner and the effort of walking showed in every step. Thomas Walker was 26 years old, and he moved like someone who had been careful with his body for a long time, because he couldn't afford not to be. He looked at Hannah, then at Ethan. "She's the teacher," Thomas said. "Yes?" Ethan said. "You told me about her." Ethan glanced sideways. "I mentioned her." "You mentioned her 4 times in one letter." Thomas's voice was thin, but his eyes were sharp. He looked at Hannah. "He said you were stubborn." "He's right," Hannah said. "He also said—" Thomas started coughing. It bent him forward, and Ethan's hand came to his back, immediately steady, and practiced the movement of someone who had done this many times and was careful not to let his own face show what it cost him every time. "Later," Ethan said quietly when Thomas straightened. "You can tell her later. Right now we need to move." Cade had not stopped them. He stood by the jail door with his hands at his sides and the look of a man running numbers that weren't adding up the way they used to. "Walker," Cade called. Ethan stopped. Didn't turn fully. "Victor Harlan has done a lot for this valley," Cade said. He said it like a man reminding himself. "I know what Victor Harlan has done for this valley," Ethan said. "It's in writing." He helped Thomas onto the horse behind Hannah and took the reins himself and walked, and Cade did not follow and did not call for help and did not do anything at all for a long moment. Then he went inside and sat at his desk and looked at the wall. They were at the Calloway place within the hour. Ruth Calloway took one look at Thomas and had him on the good cot with a blanket and a cup of something hot, before anyone had fully explained the situation, because Ruth Calloway was a woman who processed crisis through action, and questions came later. Jesse and Cal were sent outside. The door closed. Hannah laid the ledger on the table. "Victor knows we have it," Ethan said. "He knows we've wired Helena. He has—" He looked at Hannah. 12 hours, she said. Maybe less. The Territorial Marshal's office will move fast once they see what's in that wire, but Victor will move first if he can. Ruth looked at the ledger, then at Hannah. "What does he do?" Ruth asked. "When cornered?" "He's never been cornered," Ethan said. "I don't know." "He escalates," Hannah said. Both of them looked at her. Every time someone pushed back, he escalated. Mitchell speaks up at the town meeting. Harlan burns the Calloway barn. We go to the land office. He empties the mountain cabin and moves Thomas. He doesn't retreat. He increases the cost. She looked at the ledger. Which means when he finds out the wire has been sent, he won't run. He'll come here. Here, Ruth said flatly. He'll want the ledger back, and he'll want the witnesses gone before the marshal arrives. Hannah looked at Ruth. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought— Don't, Ruth said sharply. Don't apologize for bringing this to my table. My barn burned. My boys have been scared for 3 months. My husband has been dead for 2 years, and I have wondered every day since whether it was really the fever that took him or whether there was something else. Her voice was controlled and terrible. Don't apologize for finally giving me a way to fight back. The room was very quiet. Then Hannah said, We need people. I know, Ruth said. She stood up. I know exactly who to ask. What happened in the next 4 hours was the thing that Hannah would think about for the rest of her life when she needed to remember what people were capable of when they stopped being afraid. Ruth Calloway rode to 6 farms. She didn't make speeches. She said, Victor Harlan's ledger is at my table. It has your name in it, and Mitchell Abernethy's, and the Morrison family's, and Garrett's. A territorial marshal is riding. Victor is coming. Come to the Calloway place if you've had enough. She was back in under 2 hours. She brought 11 people with her. Mitchell Abernethy, who could not stand fully straight but stood anyway. The Miller family. 2 ranchers whose names Hannah didn't know, but whose faces she recognized from the town hall, meeting the men who had sat and said nothing while Victor spoke. A woman named Grace Elroy, who turned out to have been keeping her own records in a journal under her floorboards for 18 months, dates, incidents, descriptions which she handed to Hannah without ceremony, and said, I didn't know who to give it to until now, and Prescott. Hannah hadn't expected Prescott. He came alone on foot with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who had been running one specific calculation for a very long time and had finally arrived at the conclusion. He stopped in the doorway of the Calloway kitchen and looked at Hannah. I know what you have, he said. My name's in there. Yes, Hannah said. I want to talk to the marshal before anyone else does. I can't promise. I can give you 4 names in the Territorial Land Board, not just the 2 in that ledger. 4. And I can give you the original deed documents, the real ones, before Victor had me alter them. I kept copies. He swallowed. I kept them because I knew this day would come, and I needed something to trade. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. Sit down, Mr. Prescott, she said. He sat. Ethan appeared at her shoulder. She felt him there before she heard him. You trust him, he said quietly. No, she said just as quietly. But I trust what he's afraid of, and right now, that's useful. The afternoon came in hot and long, and they waited. Thomas slept on the cot in the back room, and the sound of his breathing was the sound the whole house organized itself around. Ethan sat near the back room door, and didn't pretend he was doing anything other than listening to his brother breathe. Hannah sat beside him. He's going to be all right, she said. You don't know that. I know he made it this far. She looked at the closed door. I know he has the same jaw as you, which suggests he's got the same stubbornness, which means he's not going anywhere without a fight. Ethan looked at her. Something in his face that she was beginning to recognize the expression he wore when something had reached him that he hadn't prepared a defense against. Hannah, he said. She looked at him. I don't know how to— He stopped. Started again. I'm not a man who has the right words. I know that. So I won't say them wrong. He looked at his hands. But I want you to know that whatever happens today, what you've done, for Thomas, for this valley. He looked up. I won't forget it. Hannah looked at him steadily. Good, she said. Because I'm not finished yet. The sound came from the road. Not horses, voices. The low collective sound of a group of people arriving with a purpose. Ruth appeared in the doorway of the back room. Her face was the face of a woman who had been waiting for this and was not afraid of it. "He's here," she said. "Victor Harlan. And he didn't come alone." Ethan stood. The room stood. Hannah picked up the ledger from the table and held it against her chest and thought about Clara Morrison's shoe on the porch steps, and Jesse Calloway's bruised jaw, and Mitchell Abernethy's grip on her hand outside the town hall, and how thin and desperate that gratitude had been, how much it had cost him just to say thank you. She thought about Frank Aldridge saying, "I've been waiting for someone with a reason." She thought about Ethan Walker stepping out of the tree line with a rifle and cold eyes and one word, and how she'd hated him for working for the wrong man and how wrong she had been. She walked to the front door. Ethan was beside her. Victor Harlan stood in the yard of the Calloway farm with 6 armed men behind him and the last of the afternoon light on his silver temples, and for the first time since Hannah had met him, the warmth was completely gone from his face. What was underneath it was not dramatic or theatrical. It was just cold. The cold of a man who had made the decision that problems needed to be finished. He looked at the open door, at Hannah, at the ledger. His jaw tightened. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Hannah looked at him across the yard. "No," she said clearly. "I have something that belongs to the territory of Montana, and to Mitchell Abernethy, and to the Morrisons and the Delacroix, and to the family of a man named Garrett, who died on a trail that witnesses say was perfectly safe." Victor's eyes moved to Ethan. "Ethan," he said. The voice of a man who still believed in the power of a name said a certain way. "You know what happens now?" "Yes," Ethan said. "I do." He stepped out of the doorway and into the yard. Behind Victor's men, a sound. Horses on the road. Multiple horses coming fast from the north. Victor turned. 4 riders coming down from the ridge. Hard riding. United States Marshal's seal on the lead rider's coat. The wire had reached Helena. The marshal had been closer than any of them had hoped already, riding toward the Bitterroot on an older complaint, and Frank's wire had met him on the road. Victor looked at the marshal, looked at his 6 men, looked at the 11 people standing in the doorway and yard of the Calloway farm, farmers and ranchers, and a land office clerk with copies of original deeds, and an 81-year-old man who had apparently ridden 12 miles in the dark to be present for this moment. Frank Aldridge was there. Hannah hadn't known he'd come. He stood at the edge of the group with his rifle at his side and his hat on straight and the patient expression of a man who had been waiting a long time. Victor looked at all of it. He looked at the ledger in Hannah's hands. He made a decision. "Put your guns down," he said to his men. One of them shifted. "Mr. Harlan?" I said, "Put them down." His voice was flat and final. "It's over." The guns came down. The marshal rode into the yard and dismounted and looked at Hannah. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm Marshal Holt. I received a wire from Helena about a ledger." Hannah held it out. "Every page is in his hand," she said. "There's a land office clerk inside who can provide corroborating documentation, and a journal from one of the local residents with 18 months of dated incident records." Marshal Holt took the ledger, opened it, looked at the first page, closed it. "Victor Harlan," he said. He didn't raise his voice. "You'll come with me." Victor Harlan, who had run the Bitterroot Valley for 14 years, and who had never once been stopped, looked at the marshal, and then at the ledger, and then at Ethan Walker, standing in the yard of the Calloway farm, with the afternoon light on his face, and the look of a man who had finally put something down that he had been carrying too long. Victor said nothing. He walked to the marshal's horse and stood to be cuffed, and did not look at anyone again. The 6 men behind him let their guns stay on the ground and looked at each other, and then at the assembled valley people, and made the quiet individual calculations of men who understood which way the day had gone. Ruth Calloway walked out into the yard and looked at the space where Victor Harlan had been standing. Then she looked at Hannah. "My husband," she said. "Can we find out?" "Yes," Hannah said. "Prescott has records. We'll find out." Ruth nodded, pressed her lips together, stood straight. Jesse Calloway came around from the back of the house where he'd been listening with his brother and looked at his mother and then at the mounted marshal and then finally at Hannah. "Is it done?" he asked. Hannah looked at the ledger in the marshal's hand, at Victor Harlan walking to the marshal's horse, at Mitchell Abernethy standing in the yard with his battered face and his whole body held carefully and the look of a man who could not quite believe what he was seeing. "Not completely," she said honestly. "There'll be a trial. There's work still to do." She looked at Jesse. "But the worst part is done." Jesse looked at the yard for another moment. Then he said, "Can I come back to school on Monday?" Hannah felt something break open in her chest, the good kind of, breaking the kind that made room. "Yes," she said. "Monday. Bring Cal." Ethan came up beside her. He didn't touch her, just stood there, shoulder to shoulder in the fading afternoon. "Thomas," she said quietly. "Marshall can arrange a proper doctor," Ethan said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Holt knows a man in Helena. He told me when he came in." "Good." Hannah. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the full weight of the day on his face and something else beneath it, something that had been there for a while and had been waiting for a moment when there wasn't a crisis between them. "I still don't have the right words," he said. "I know," she said, "but I meant what I said earlier." He held her gaze. "I'm not finished either." She understood what he meant. She looked at the mountains above the valley, the Bitterroot peaks turning gold in the last of the sun. The same mountains they'd ridden through in the dark, with his arm around her and the ledger between them and the stars overhead. "Neither am I," she said. The trial was set for September in the county seat, and the summer between Victor Harlan's arrest and the first day of proceedings was the strangest season Hannah Brooks had ever lived through. Strange, because it was both harder and quieter than anything that had come before. The crisis had a shape, a beginning, a middle, a night ride through mountains with shots behind them, and a ledger pressed against her ribs. But the aftermath had no clean shape at all. It was paperwork and depositions and the particular exhaustion of people who had held themselves together under pressure, finally allowing themselves to come apart slightly, now that the pressure had eased. Mitchell Abernethy cried in Hannah's classroom 3 days after Victor's arrest. He came in the late afternoon when the children were gone, sat in one of the student chairs with his big frame folded into it, and wept without apology or explanation for about 4 minutes. Then he wiped his face and said, "My grandfather homesteaded that land. I thought I was going to lose it." Hannah sat in the chair beside him and said nothing and let him have it. That was all he needed. Ruth Calloway didn't cry. Ruth Calloway threw herself into the work of reconstruction with a ferocity that was almost frightening to witness, organizing the return of the Morrison and Delacroix families, coordinating with Marshall Holt's office on the deed restoration process, managing the informal network of Valley families who were simultaneously relieved and furious and didn't quite know what to do with either feeling. She came to Hannah every 3 days with a list of questions and left with answers and never once said thank you, which Hannah understood was Ruth's particular form of respect. Ruth didn't thank people she considered equals. Jesse and Cal were back in school on Monday as promised. Clara Morrison came back 2 weeks later when her family returned to the valley. She walked into the classroom and found her reader on her desk. Hannah had kept it there and looked up at Hannah with an expression that was too large and too complicated for a child's face, and said nothing at all. Hannah said, "Page 47, we've been waiting for you." And Clara sat down and opened the book. That was a good day. Most days were good in the slow, incremental way of things being put back together. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Ruth's barn was still a scorched foundation. Mitchell still moved carefully, favoring his left side. The Morrison family came back to a house that had sat empty and felt it. These were facts of the landscape now permanent as the mountains and the valley had to absorb them into whatever it was becoming. But the becoming was real. That was the thing Hannah held onto when the paperwork got heavy and the deposition process ground slowly, and Marshall Holt's letters from Helena were full of legal language that required careful reading. The valley was becoming something. That had not been true 2 months ago. Thomas Walker was in Helena. Ethan had ridden him there himself in a wagon fitted with blankets against the summer dust the week after the arrest. The doctor Holt had recommended was a young man from Philadelphia who had come west for reasons that seemed to involve equal parts idealism and adventure, and who turned out to be, by all accounts, genuinely skilled. His letter to Ethan 3 weeks later said that Thomas's lungs were damaged, but not destroyed. That careful management and the right altitude higher was better. The dry mountain air could stabilize his condition significantly. That Thomas Walker was not a man who was dying. He was a man who needed to be careful. Ethan had read that letter standing in the Calloway yard where Hannah happened to be talking to Ruth. She'd watched him read it. Watched the stillness move through him, not the controlled stillness he wore as armor, but the other kind. The stillness of a man receiving something he hadn't let himself hope for, and didn't know what to do with now that it had arrived. He'd folded the letter, put it in his pocket, looked up, and found Hannah watching him. He'd walked over to her, held the letter out. She read it, handed it back. "Good," she said. One word. The same weight he put in his own single words. Something moved across his face. "Yeah," he said. He went back to work. But he didn't ride back to the mountains that evening. He'd been staying in Frank Aldridge's spare room since the arrest, temporary. He'd said, though the definition of that word seemed to be expanding by the week. He helped Frank with his fencing, which was Hannah had come to understand Ethan's default response to emotional complexity. When the world was too large, he fixed something. She didn't mind. She understood it. She had her own version of it when things were too large for her. She graded papers. They were alike in this, she and Ethan Walker, in ways she hadn't expected when she'd watched him walk away from her in the dark outside the town hall, and thought him the most self-contained person she'd ever met. He wasn't self-contained, he was careful. There was a difference. The first twist no one had anticipated came in the second week of August, from a direction nobody had been watching. Prescott, in his deposition to the territorial attorney, named 4 members of the land board as Hannah had expected. What no one had expected was the 5th name. A judge. A territorial judge in Helena, who had been quietly ensuring that any legal challenge to Victor Harlan's land acquisitions was assigned to his docket, and then dismissed on procedural grounds. For 6 years, Marshall Holt rode back to Harlan Creek to deliver the news personally. He sat at Ruth's kitchen table and laid it out plainly. The case had grown past a local criminal matter into a territorial corruption investigation. The Attorney General's office in Helena was now involved. 3 federal investigators were coming. "This is bigger than Harlan Creek," Holt said. "It always was," Hannah said. Holt looked at her. "The Attorney General wants your deposition, Miss Brooks. In Helena. In person. You're the one who found the ledger." "We found the ledger," she said. "Ethan Walker knows that mountain property better than I do. Frank Aldridge gave us the map. Grace Elroy's journal corroborates 18 months of incidents. He wants all of you," Holt said. "But he asked for you specifically, Miss Brooks, because of the town hall meeting." He paused. "Because you were the first person in this valley to say it out loud. In public. On record." Hannah sat with that for a moment. "When?" she asked. 3 weeks. She nodded. "I'll need someone to teach school while I'm gone." Holt blinked, like that was not the response he'd expected. Ruth Calloway from the doorway said, "I can do it," in the tone of a woman who had been waiting for an opportunity to be more useful. Hannah looked at her. "Can you read?" "Better than you," Ruth said pleasantly. That apparently was settled. Ethan came to find her that evening. He found her behind the school building in the last of the summer light, sitting on an upturned crate and reading through the letter from the Attorney General's office that Holt had left with her. He sat beside her without asking if she wanted company. She didn't look up from the letter. "You heard," she said. "Ruth told me." I have to go to Helena. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I'll go with you. She looked up from the letter. You don't? Thomas is there, he said, simply. I haven't seen him since I brought him in. And he paused. I want to be there, for the deposition, if they call me. They will. Then I'll be there. He looked at the letter in her hands. 3 weeks. Yes. He nodded, looked at his hands. Hannah. He said her name the same way he'd said it in the mountain cabin, carefully, like it was something he'd been carrying and was now setting down deliberately. I've been meaning to say something. For a while. I keep not saying it. She folded the letter and looked at him. Then say it, she said. He looked up. I lost someone, he said. Before. A woman I was going to marry. Stage robbery 4 years ago. She was killed. He said it plainly, the way he said hard things, not wrapped up just there. After that, I went into the mountains and stayed, because it was easier than all of this. He gestured slightly. People, towns, things that matter and can be lost. Hannah held his gaze and didn't say anything soft. He didn't want soft. He wanted to be heard. I worked for Victor Harlan because it required nothing from me, he continued. It was simple, brutal eventually, but simple. No one needed me to be anything other than a man who could fix a fence and keep his mouth shut. He paused. And then you came and stood up in that meeting and said what no one else would say, and I thought God help you, because I meant it. I thought you were going to get yourself killed. I nearly did, she said. Yes. He looked at her. But you made it so I couldn't stay in the simple place anymore. Because you needed someone. And the someone who could help was me. And I couldn't look at what you were doing and what it cost you and go back to fixing fences for a corrupt man just because it was easier. He exhaled. You made me remember what I was supposed to be. The summer evening was warm and still around them. Somewhere in the town a dog was barking. Children's voices distant. Ethan, Hannah said quietly. I'm not done, he said. She waited. I don't have the words for the rest of it, he said. I meant that when I said it before, and I still mean it. But I want you to know whatever comes next, wherever you go from here. He met her eyes fully. I'd like to go the same direction. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the night she'd arrived in this valley with everything she owned in one trunk and 3 armed men circling her in the dark. She thought about the man who had stepped out of the tree line with a rifle and cold eyes and one word, and then walked her 4 miles to town on foot, because the horse was carrying enough. She thought about him fixing a broken fence in the summer heat for families that weren't his, and reading a letter about his brother's lungs in the Callaway yard, with the stillness of a man who had been so careful not to hope that receiving something good had left him without a language for it. The land you want, she said. The small piece of ground, your own. Yes. Is there room in that picture for a school? He looked at her. A school. I can't go where there are no children who need teaching. That's not a condition I'm apologizing for. Something shifted in his face, the slow, real thing that was better than any quick smile. There's a valley, he said, north of here 20 miles, good water, already a handful of families, no school. I know, she said. I've been corresponding with 2 of those families for a month. He stared at her. You've been planning, he said. I've been considering, she said carefully. There's a difference. Considering doesn't commit anyone to anything. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, Hannah Brooks. Ethan Walker. I would very much like to commit you to something. She felt the warmth move through her. Not the desperate warmth of fear resolved, not the electric warmth of crisis, but the steady, permanent kind that had been building since a night 4 miles outside this town when she'd decided to follow a stranger into the dark because the alternative was worse. Ask me properly, she said. He looked at her face. Then he took her hand, her left hand, with the practical care of a man who did nothing carelessly and held it. "I am not a man with poetry," he said. "I don't have speeches. What I have is, I will show up. Every time. I will fix what's broken and carry what's heavy, and I will stand next to you in any doorway you decide to walk through, regardless of what's on the other side." He looked at their joined hands. "That's what I'm offering." Hannah thought about doorways, about the schoolhouse door and the land office, and the window of Victor Harlan's east study, and the ridge above the mining cabin in the mountain dark. About every doorway she'd walked through since Missouri, and who had been beside her for the ones that counted. "That's enough," she said. "That's more than enough." He looked up. "Yes," she said clearly. He sat with that for a moment, like a man receiving something he hadn't let himself hope for, the same stillness as the letter about Thomas, the good kind. Then he brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles, a gesture so simple and so serious that Hannah felt it all the way through and let go. 3 weeks, he said. Helena first. Helena first, she agreed. He stood, put his hat on, looked down at her with the particular expression she had come to understand was Ethan Walker's version of everything words couldn't hold. "I'll ride out to Frank's," he said. "Tell him." "He'll say he already knew." Ethan almost smiled. "He will." He walked away in the summer evening, and Hannah watched him go, and this time she knew he was coming back. The deposition in Helena lasted 4 days and was one of the most exhausting experiences of Hannah Brooks's life, which was saying something given the competition. The Attorney General was a sharp-featured man named Calloway. No relation to Ruth, he assured her, though he had Ruth's same flat-eyed directness, who asked every question twice and seemed to find repetition a useful tool for testing consistency. Hannah answered everything the same way both times because she had the advantage of having lived it. On the second day, she saw Thomas Walker for the first time since the Calloway farm. He was better. She could see it immediately, not well, not fully, but better. He was sitting in the corridor outside the hearing room with a book open in his lap and color in his face that hadn't been there before, and when he looked up and saw her, he smiled. It was Ethan's smile, the slow, real one. It struck her in the chest. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Thomas." She sat beside him. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I was," he said. "The doctor here is he actually explains things. That's new." He looked at his book. "Ethan told me what you did. For the ledger. For me." He looked up. "He didn't tell me details. He's not good at details." "He's excellent at the important parts," she said. Thomas looked at her for a moment. Then he said with the directness of a younger brother who had been watching his older brother be stubborn for 26 years. "Are you going to make him happy?" Hannah looked at him. "I'm going to try." "Good enough." He looked back at his book. "He needs someone who doesn't let him go back up the mountain every time things get complicated." He turned a page. "He does that. Goes up the mountain. Thinks it's simpler up there." "I know. You'll have to keep pulling him back down." "I have practice," she said. Thomas considered that, nodded. "All right then." Ethan came down the corridor and stopped when he saw them sitting together, and looked between them with the expression of a man who had walked into a conversation about himself and knew it. "Don't," he said to Thomas. "I didn't say anything," Thomas said. "You were about to." "I was being welcoming." "You were interrogating her." "Someone has to." Thomas closed his book. She passed for what it's worth. Ethan looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Ethan. "How'd I do?" he asked. "Well enough," she said. He sat down on her other side. The three of them sat in the corridor outside the hearing room, the school teacher from Missouri and the mountain cowboy and his younger brother with the damaged lungs and the slow smile, and for a moment the whole long summer compressed itself into that corridor, all the burned barns and cut fences and empty farmhouses and mountain nights and ledgers and names said like promises, and Hannah thought this. This is what it was for.
Bademülse.
Victor Harlan's trial concluded in November. Guilty on 14 counts. Land fraud, conspiracy, bribery of public officials, and 1 count of criminal negligence in the death of a man named Garrett, whose horse, it turned out, had not been fine on that trail at all, a fact that 3 witnesses finally felt safe enough to say out loud. Prescott received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. He left Harlan Creek and did not return. Cade resigned his star before the trial concluded, and the valley got a new sheriff in December, a younger man from the Northern Territory who had read every page of the investigation report before he rode in and arrived with the particular alertness of someone who understood exactly what the job had cost its previous occupant. The Territorial Land Board was restructured. The judge in Helena resigned. 2 federal investigations opened, both of which would continue for years, and both of which had their roots in a ledger found in a mountain cabin by a woman with 2 good hands and a cowboy, who told her to hold one end while he fixed the wire. Frank Aldridge attended the verdict by himself, rode 12 miles each way, and told nobody he'd been. Hannah found out from Holt, who had seen him at the back of the courtroom, hat on, straight arms folded, watching with the expression of a man finally closing a very long account. The Morrison family's deed was restored in October. They came back to the valley on a cold, clear day, and Hannah was there when their wagon came down the road. Clara Morrison jumped from the back before it had fully stopped and ran to the schoolhouse and pressed her face against the window to see if the desks were still there. They were. Hannah had made sure of that. The second twist, the one that nobody saw coming. Not even Hannah arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October in the form of a letter from the school board of the Northern Valley. Not a letter offering her the position she'd been quietly pursuing. A letter from 3 families in that valley asking if she would consider also establishing a lending library alongside the school and enclosing collectively 47 books as a founding donation. 47 books wrapped in brown paper arriving by wagon because 3 families in a mountain valley had decided that the woman who was coming to teach their children deserved to know she was wanted. Hannah sat with those books for a long time. Then she went to find Ethan. He was at the Calloway place helping Jesse and Cal rebuild the barn, framing the actual construction, not just the foundation, which had been cleared in September. He was up on the frame when she arrived, moving along the crossbeam with the easy surety of a man, completely at home at height, and Jesse was below him, handing up timber with the focused competence of a 12-year-old who had decided he was going to be useful if it killed him. "Ethan," she called up. He looked down. She held up the letter. He read her face. Not the letter, her face. He came down from the frame without hurrying and without hesitation, which was, Hannah had decided, one of his defining qualities. He didn't hurry and he didn't delay. He just moved when it was time. He took the letter, read it again. Then he looked at her. 47 books, he said. 47 books, she said. When do you want to go? She felt the warmth move through her, the steady, permanent kind. Spring, she said. After the trial. After the deeds are all restored. After Thomas is stable through the winter. Spring, he agreed. We'll need to find land, she said. In the Northern Valley, small enough to manage, big enough to matter. He looked at her with the slow expression. Something living, he said, using his own words back. Something living, she said. He folded the letter, handed it back to her, put his hat on. I know a man up there, he said. Has a piece of ground he's been trying to sell for 2 years. Good water, south-facing slope. He looked at the mountains to the north like he was already measuring the distance. Enough room for a house and a schoolroom both. Is there space for a library? He looked at her. Hannah, he said. I will build you a library with my own hands if that's what it takes. She looked at him for a moment. At the man who had stepped out of the dark with a rifle and no good options, and a brother to protect, and a grief he'd been carrying alone in the mountains for 4 years. At the man who fixed fences for people he didn't owe anything to, and told the truth when it cost him, and held her hand to his mouth in the summer evening with the simple seriousness of someone for whom no gesture was casual. "I know you will," she said. Above them, Jesse Calloway called down from the barn frame. "Are you two going to talk all day, or can somebody hand me that hammer?" Ethan picked up the hammer, looked at Hannah. She smiled. He smiled back, the real one, the slow one, the one that had been coming in pieces since the first night on the dark road, and was now finally fully assembled. He went back up the frame. Hannah walked back to the schoolhouse with the letter in her hand and 47 books waiting at Ruth Calloway's barn, and a spring still ahead of them. And she thought about the night she'd arrived in this valley with everything she owned in one trunk, and 3 armed men, and a dark road, and a stranger who turned out to be the kind of man the world tried to use up and failed. She thought about all the empty desks that were full again, about Mitchell Abernethy standing straight, about Clara Morrison with her face pressed against the schoolhouse window, about Frank Aldridge at 81 riding 12 miles alone to watch Justice close an account he'd been keeping for 30 years, about a young man in a Helena corridor with his brother's slow smile saying someone has to keep pulling him back down, about Ethan Walker saying, "I will show up," every time. She sat at her desk, opened her gradebook, picked up her pen. Outside, the sound of the barn frame going up, hammer on timber. Jesse's voice, Cal's answering laugh, Ethan's low direction cutting through it all, steady and calm and present. Spring was coming, the valley was healing. And Hannah Brooks, who had come to Montana with a trunk and a teaching contract and the stubborn conviction that silence in the face of wrong was its own kind of wrong, sat in the school she had refused to abandon and understood with the full and quiet certainty of a woman who had earned it that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The hard part was finished. The good part was just beginning. And this time, she did not face it alone.